The snow had begun before dusk, fine as sifted flour, drifting down through a sky the color of old pewter. By the time Amelia Rich reached her cabin, the prairie was already veiled in white, every fence post and pine bough softened under the weight. She pulled her shawl tighter, boots crunching along the frozen earth, breath unspooling in clouds. The wind pressed against her, as if to remind her she was small and solitary, and the world was vast. She had lived with that reminder for years now. Inside, her cabin was little more than timber walls and the faint glow of a hearth. She laid her basket of flour and salt on the rough-hewn table, fingers stiff from cold. The silence inside pressed close. No voices, no laughter, only the groan of logs as they settled into embers. It was a silence she had grown accustomed to, though never reconciled with. Loneliness can be worn like a second skin, and she wore it every day. In town that morning, the silence had not been hers. There it had been broken by whispers trailing her steps, the pointed stares of women gathered near the mercantile. Martha Holloway's voice had carried louder than the rest, asking no one in particular, "What kind of woman chooses to live alone like that? Not right, not natural." Their words clung to Amelia as the snow now did to her cloak, cold, invasive, impossible to shake off. She had walked with her chin lifted, though her throat had burned with humiliation. She busied herself now with stirring the fire, willing the heat to reach deeper than her chilled skin. Her reflection caught in the frosted window. A young woman still, though her face carried lines etched by shame more than age. 26 and already treated as if she had lived beyond her season. She thought of Elias Boone, how he had once courted her with a rancher's confidence, and how swiftly he had turned away, dismissing her as too proud, too strange. His rejection had sealed her fate in the eyes of the town. A woman unwanted. A woman unchosen. The snow thickened as night deepened, rattling the shutters, brushing against the door like restless hands. Amelia rose to latch it firmly, and stopped. There, through the blur of falling flakes, stood two figures. For a moment she thought them trees, until they moved. Tall, giant, even, shoulders draped in hides, hair white as the snow around them. Faces marked by time, yet carved with a dignity that seemed to hold the storm itself at bay. Her heart thudded. Apaches! She had heard stories of raids in her father's time, though those days had long since waned. Still, their presence here at her door was as startling as if ghosts had come walking. She held her breath as one of them stepped forward, his shadow stretching across the snowlit yard. He did not knock. His voice carried low, deliberate, yet softened by exhaustion. "We ask only one night." The other stood behind him, broad as a gate, eyes catching the firelight leaking from her window. They looked like men carved from stone, yet the storm had humbled them, wrapped their shoulders in white dust, made them look older, wearier. Amelia's first thought was of the town. What they would say, how they would condemn her should anyone learn. Already she bore the weight of whispers. This would break her entirely. Yet another thought came unbidden, as sharp as it was quiet. She knew what it meant to be turned away at a door. Her hand trembled on the latch. She could feel her pulse in her wrist, hear her breath quicken. The warmth of the cabin pressed behind her, safe and solitary. Outside, the storm bent trees like pennants. Two men, proud and strange, waited with snow in their hair. "Please," the first added, and the word, though simple, was laden with the weight of hunger, of distance traveled, of dignity laid low enough to ask. She opened the door wider, the hinge crying out. The rush of cold filled the room. For an instant, silence again. Her eyes meeting theirs, the storm swirling around them like a curtain. Then she stepped aside. They entered with the solemnity of men stepping into sacred ground. Neither spoke further. One lowered himself near the fire, his frame bending with careful restraint, as though not to break her fragile chairs. The other stood, tall as the beams, then slowly removed the frost-bitten cloak from his shoulders. The cabin seemed smaller with them inside, the air heavier, the firelight painting their lined faces in amber. Amelia's hands moved before her mind could catch up, setting another log to the fire, placing tin cups on the table. Bread, what little she had, she laid out. She did not ask their names, nor did they ask hers. Yet their silence was not like the one she had borne for years. This silence carried weight, history, wounds invisible but present in the way their eyes shifted to the flames rather than to her. As she sat across from them, she felt her chest tighten. For the first time in a long while, she was not alone in the cabin. The loneliness she had worn so long shifted, not gone, but stirred. She studied their faces in the firelight. The scars, the white hair, the sharp lines softened by fatigue. They did not look at her with pity or judgment, only with the heavy calm of men who had lived much and lost more. Outside, the storm raged on. Snow piled against the door, muting the world. The town seemed far away, yet its voices haunted her still, promising condemnation. She thought of Martha's words, of Elias Boone's smirk, of all the times she had lowered her gaze under their weight. And she wondered, staring at these strangers, if she could bear the town's judgment once more, or if, perhaps for the sake of dignity, she could ignore it. One of the men, the broader one, reached into his cloak and set a small, broken carving on the table. A bird, its wing chipped, its body weathered smooth. He did not speak, but the gesture was plain. Something carried, something endured. Amelia stared at it, then at him, feeling the fire crackle louder between them. The night pressed closer, and the cabin glowed against it, a fragile island in a sea of snow. Amelia's heart beat fast, her breath shallow, her shame and fear mingled with an unfamiliar warmth. She did not know what dawn would bring. Town gossip, suspicion, perhaps worse, but she knew the course of her night had changed. The wind howled, rattling the roof as though urging her to choose. To shut herself back into solitude, or to open, at last, to something unknown. And as she leaned closer to the fire, the two giants of white hair seated across from her, their shadows cast tall against the log walls, Amelia realized she had already chosen. The storm outside roared louder, yet inside her chest another storm stirred. One not of snow, but of defiance, of connection, of fragile hope waiting to be tested. The fire burned low, but its glow clung stubbornly to the cabin walls, painting them with restless shadows. Amelia sat rigid on her chair, hands folded in her lap, eyes moving between the two figures who had entered her solitude. They had taken places without asking. One kneeling beside the hearth, coaxing warmth into his bones, the other settling against the wall as if his body bore too many miles to stand any longer. Their silence was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of men who had weathered too much to waste words. Amelia studied them cautiously, trying not to seem as though she stared. The taller of the two, with hair that cascaded in white strands past his shoulders, had eyes that caught the fire and held it. They were dark, deep, unreadable, yet not cruel. His jaw bore the memory of battles, a scar running along his cheek like a line carved by lightning. The other, broader and heavier, had hands marked by old wounds. He lifted one now, flexing fingers stiff with cold, and Amelia saw the thin pale ridges crossing his knuckles. She wondered how many winters, how many conflicts, had etched themselves into those hands. A log cracked, throwing sparks that leapt before fading into ash. The taller one finally spoke, his voice low, resonant, as though it came from far beneath the surface of the earth. "We do not mean trouble. We carry no weapons for you." He gestured to the hearth, palms open. "Only the storm." Amelia swallowed. "The storm can kill as easily as steel." He inclined his head, as if her words had confirmed something he already knew. The other man gave a faint nod, his mouth tight, his gaze fixed not on her but on the flickering flames. She found herself speaking before she thought better. "Why here?" The taller man turned his face toward her fully then, and for a moment she felt her breath hitch. Not because of fear, but because of the gravity she saw in his eyes. "Because your light burned," he said simply. "In miles of darkness, it was the only one." Amelia felt heat rise in her cheeks, not from the fire but from the strange intimacy of his answer. She looked down at her hands, suddenly aware of how tightly she clenched them. The town's voices echoed in her memory, sharp with judgment. To have two strangers here, Apaches no less, was to invite scandal, even danger. And yet, looking at them, she could not turn them out. Their weariness was plain, their pride already humbled by the storm. The broader man shifted, leaning forward to rest his heavy forearms on his knees. At last he spoke, his voice rough, like stones rolling downriver. We have walked too long without shelter. Many doors have closed. He did not say whose doors, but Amelia understood. White doors. Her chest tightened. She thought of her own doors slammed shut, not in timber, but in the eyes of her neighbors, in Elias Boone's rejection. Shame knew no boundary between color or blood. It lived wherever men and women turned each other away. She rose, slowly, and placed more bread on the table. Their gazes followed her movement, though neither reached for it. She sat again, folding her skirt neatly, willing her hands not to tremble. "Eat," she said, more command than invitation. They obeyed, not greedily, but with the quiet efficiency of men accustomed to hunger. Each bite seemed measured, respectful. She watched the way their hands moved, deliberate, disciplined. She thought of the rough laughter of men in town when they ate, loud and careless. These strangers carried themselves differently, as though even in exhaustion they would not be seen small. As the fire warmed the room, the air shifted. Words trickled between them, fragments only. The taller spoke of rivers crossed, of land shrinking beneath boots. The broader mentioned a wife gone many winters past, his voice catching like a splinter. Amelia said little, but her silence was not emptiness, it was listening. For years her own words had fallen into a void. Tonight, for the first time, she felt the weight of other stories pressing against her own. She noticed then the small carving still resting on the table. The bird. She reached toward it, fingertips brushing its worn edges. "Yours?" The broader man nodded. "Made for me. Long ago." His eyes glimmered with something unspoken. "Loss, perhaps." Amelia returned it gently, her throat thick with the respect such tokens deserved. The storm rattled the roof, sleet slicing against the shutters. In its rhythm, Amelia sensed the faint beat of kinship. Fragile, yes, but real. These men carried wounds unseen, as she did. Their scars marked their bodies. Hers were hidden inside, yet both had been carved by rejection. And still, she thought, what would the town say? Already whispers clung to her name. Tomorrow, if any saw, the rumors would sharpen into knives. She imagined Martha Holloway's mouth twisting, Elias Boone's smirk. They would condemn her for kindness as swiftly as they had condemned her for pride. The weight of it pressed heavy on her chest. The taller man seemed to sense it. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes steady on her face. "You fear them," he said, not as accusation but as fact. Her jaw tightened. "I fear what they can take from me." He nodded once, slowly. "They already have." The words struck harder than she expected. She lowered her gaze, heat pricking her eyes. He was right. Her dignity, her place, her belonging, all stripped by whispers and one man's dismissal. What more could they take? And yet fear still clung, stubborn as frost on windowpanes. The broader man's voice rumbled then, soft yet certain. "A fire cannot hide its smoke. But it still burns." His gaze slid to the flames and Amelia followed it, her eyes stinging. For a moment, no one spoke. The fire cracked, wind moaned, and the room felt alive with something unspoken yet binding. Amelia's heart throbbed, not with fear now, but with the faint stirrings of defiance. She had let others define her worth too long. Perhaps in these strangers she saw a mirror, two men despised and yet unbroken. She rose to stoke the fire, her movements slow, deliberate, as though anchoring herself. The taller man's eyes followed her, calm and unwavering. She did not flinch this time. The storm outside grew harsher, battering the cabin, snow piling higher against the door. Within, the air grew warmer, the silence shifting from uneasy to companionable. Amelia sat again, shoulders looser, breath steadier. She felt the faintest thread of strength weaving through her. Still, fear lingered. Tomorrow would come, and with it the town's gaze. She could not hide forever. As if echoing her thought, a sound carried faintly through the night. Distant voices, muffled but real. Men, perhaps, carried by the storm's howl. Her heart lurched, and she turned sharply toward the door. The two strangers stilled, listening. The fire flickered, throwing their shadows tall against the walls. Amelia's pulse quickened, her body rigid with sudden dread. The cabin, once sanctuary, now seemed fragile as glass. The taller man's hand brushed the carving on the table, steady, deliberate, while his gaze locked with hers. His look held no fear, only a question, one she knew would demand an answer soon. The storm raged louder, but it was not the only storm pressing at her door. Morning arrived muted, as though the storm had pressed its hand over the world to hush it. Snow lay heavy across the prairie, a white shroud that caught the pale light of dawn. Amelia rose early, her breath clouding in the cabin, the air sharp with cold even near the embers. Behind her, the two men stirred slowly, their movements deliberate, dignified even in weariness. She brewed coffee, the bitter scent mingling with smoke, and set it before them without a word. They accepted with nods, silent gratitude in their eyes. It should have ended there. Hospitality for a night, departure at first light. Yet when Amelia pulled her shawl close and lifted her basket to head into town for flour and lamp oil, they followed. She hadn't asked, hadn't offered, but neither had she stopped them. Their presence behind her, tall and quiet as sentinels, unsettled and steadied her at once. The path into town was cut through drifts, boots sinking deep, breaths sharp in the frozen air. When they reached the main street, the shift was immediate. Heads turned, conversation died, and eyes fixed upon them with a mixture of fear, disdain, and morbid curiosity. Amelia felt the sting of every gaze like nettles on her skin. Martha Holloway stood on the mercantile porch, her bonnet dusted with snow, her mouth already curling with malice. "Well, look at that," she drawled, voice pitched to Carrie. "Seems Miss Rich has found herself company at last. Took the savages to do it." Laughter rippled among the gathered women, brittle as ice. Amelia's cheeks flamed. She kept her eyes forward, gripping her basket tight enough that her knuckles whitened. But her ears burned with every word, every whisper. They cut deeper than knives. Inside the mercantile, the judgment followed. The shopkeeper, Mr. Garrison, measured out flour with heavy reluctance, his jaw tight, his eyes sliding toward the Apaches with suspicion. "Careful, Miss Rich," he muttered, though loud enough for others to hear. "Some company isn't fit for a lady alone." Her throat tightened, shame clawing up. She wanted to explain. Say it was only one night, that they had asked for nothing more than warmth. But no explanation would matter. In this town, perception was truth, and her truth had already been written by others. When she stepped back into the snow, Elias Boone was waiting. His broad shoulders blocked the path, his smirk as sharp as she remembered. "I knew you were proud, Amelia, but this?" He swept his gaze over the two men, lingering with contempt. Bringing them here, parading them like trophies? Shameful. Her stomach dropped. She remembered when that same gaze had once softened at her smile, before he'd cast her aside with words that still echoed. Not worth the trouble. She swallowed hard, her pulse hammering. One of the Apaches shifted slightly, a subtle step closer. Dakota, the broader one. He didn't speak, but his presence was steady, a wall behind her. It gave her spine the faintest steel. "Move aside, Elias," she said, though her voice quivered. He chuckled, low and cutting. "Careful. People talk. And once talk starts, it sticks." She walked past him, each step deliberate though her knees trembled. The men followed, silent as shadows. Around her the townsfolk whispered, words thick as snow in the air. Disgrace, shameless, ruined. Back at the cabin, Amelia set the basket down with shaking hands. Her breath came ragged, and tears pricked at her eyes though she fought them back. She had borne whispers for years, but today they cut differently, sharper, deeper, because she was not only shamed for who she was but for what she had dared to do. Open her door, extend kindness. She pressed her palms to her face, shoulders trembling. "They will never let me forget this," she whispered. Chayton, the taller one, stood by the window, watching snow drift against the glass. His voice came low, steady. "Their words are wind. Wind cannot stop fire." She lowered her hands, her breath hitching. "Their words ruined me once." He turned, his dark eyes steady, unyielding. "Only if you believe them." Dakota crouched near the hearth, adding wood to the flames. "We have lived with words sharper than blades. Yet here we are." His scarred hands moved with calm purpose, as though feeding the fire was answer enough. Amelia's chest tightened. Their resilience was plain, their dignity unbroken even under the weight of prejudice. She envied it, yearned for it. But envy alone could not silence the town's judgment. The hours passed slowly. Outside, children's laughter carried faintly, but in her cabin there was only the steady crackle of flames, the measured breaths of men accustomed to silence. Amelia moved about her tasks, but her mind replayed the morning. Martha's scorn, Elias's sneer. Shame pressed like ice in her veins. By afternoon, she stood at the door, gazing at the endless sweep of white. "I can't keep you here," she said softly. "If they see again—" Her words broke off. Neither man answered immediately. Then Chayton stepped forward, laying a hand on the rough doorframe, his fingers brushing old splinters. "We do not stay where we are not wanted." His tone was matter-of-fact, not bitter. Something inside her cracked. "It isn't that I don't want you," she whispered, throat tight. "It's that they don't. And I don't know if I am strong enough to stand against them." Dakota lifted his head then, eyes catching the firelight. "Strength is not in standing alone. It is in standing, even while afraid." Amelia's breath faltered. She looked at them, two men weathered by rejection greater than hers, yet still upright, still carrying dignity like armor. In them, she saw the possibility of something she had not dared. Defiance. But fear was not easily shaken. She turned back to the snow, her reflection faint in the frosted glass. "They will break me," she murmured. Behind her the fire popped, throwing sparks that leapt before dying. The room smelled of smoke and bread, warm and human against the cold. And in that warmth, she realized something. The town could wound her, yes, but the deepest wound was the one she inflicted upon herself, by believing their judgment. Her hands steadied on the sill. She inhaled slowly, letting the breath fill her chest. Shame still lingered, but alongside it rose a faint ember of defiance, small but alive. Evening came, shadows stretching across the snow. From the distance, faint lights moved through town. The glow of lanterns, gathering, voices carrying through the cold. Amelia stiffened, heart racing. The men noticed too. Chayton's gaze sharpened. Dakota's jaw tightened. They exchanged a glance, wordless yet full of understanding. Amelia stepped back from the window, her breath ragged. She knew what those lanterns meant. The town was not finished. The storm of gossip had become a storm at her door. The storm returned with a vengeance, hurling snow against the cabin, as if the night itself meant to bury them. The wind moaned through the pines, and drifts climbed higher against the door. Inside, the fire burned fierce, its glow throwing long, restless shadows that seemed to lean close to listen. Amelia sat near the hearth, her shawl gathered tight, her face pale in the flickering light. Chayton and Dakota moved with the quiet patience of men long accustomed to waiting out storms, their presence steady, unshaken. Yet Amelia's pulse raced, for beyond the howl of wind she had heard voices. Lanterns bobbed faintly in the distance, weaving through the snow like will-o'-the-wisps. The sight had frozen her blood. She knew what it meant. Townsmen, stirred by gossip, emboldened by Elias Boone's sneers, marching toward her door. They came not for warmth but for judgment. The storm pressed louder, rattling the shutters. Chayton stood by the window, arms folded, his profile etched in amber firelight. He did not ask questions. He already knew. Dakota crouched at the fire, feeding logs into the flames, as though preparing the cabin itself for endurance. Amelia rose, her hands trembling. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know it. They won't let this rest." Chayton turned, his gaze steady, grave. "You fear their eyes." "I fear their power," she admitted, throat tight. "They decide who belongs. And I've never belonged." Dakota looked up from the fire, his scarred hands steady. "Belonging is a chain," he rumbled. "Better to stand free." The words struck her, yet fear gnawed still. She could already imagine Martha's sharp tongue, Elias's smirk, the sheriff's heavy silence. They would brand her ruin beyond repair. And these two men, exiles themselves, would be her undoing. The wind howled louder, shaking the roof beams. Chayton stepped toward her, each movement deliberate, calm as if carved from stone. He placed the carved bird, Takota's talisman, into her hand. "Hold this," he said softly. "It remembers storms greater than this one." Her fingers closed around the worn wood, warmth blooming against her palm despite the cold. She looked up into his eyes, so dark, so fathomless, and for a heartbeat her fear eased. But outside, the voices grew clearer, rough, muffled shouts swallowed by the snow. The storm did not silence them, it carried them. Amelia's breath quickened. "They'll break down the door." Takota rose now, towering, his frame filling the space. "Then let them find fire inside." He glanced at Chayton, and something unspoken passed between them. A lifetime of brotherhood compressed into a single look. The moments stretched, taut as a wire. Amelia could hear her heartbeat louder than the storm. She thought of every whisper, every stare, every dismissal she had endured. All the years of being unwanted. And she wondered, if they forced her to choose tonight, would she stand with shame or with defiance? The first knock came sudden, brutal, shaking the frame. Amelia flinched, clutching the carving tight. Another blow followed, then a voice, Elias Boone's, unmistakable, mocking. "Amelia! Open up! Let us see the fine company you keep." Her stomach turned. Shame flared like fire through her veins, but with it came anger, sharp and rising. She turned toward the door, breath shallow, while behind her the two men stood in silence, their dignity unyielding. Chayton's voice was low, steady. "Your choice. Not ours." The blows rattled again, voices swelling. "Open up. We won't have it. Shameful woman." Their words clawed through the wood, dragging her deepest wounds into the open. Tears pricked her eyes, hot against the cold seeping through the cracks. She wanted to scream, to hide, to vanish. But instead she straightened, her shoulders stiff. She had spent too many years bent under their judgment. Tonight, something in her refused to break further. She moved to the door, lifted the bar, and flung it open. Snow burst inside, lantern light casting cruel shadows across familiar faces. Elias at the front, smug, Martha's husband beside him, others from town behind, their expressions twisted with scorn. The wind whipped Amelia's hair, her shawl tugged by invisible hands. She stood trembling in the doorway, the two white-haired giants looming just behind her, firelight at their backs. Elias's grin widened. "There it is. Proof enough. She shelters them." His eyes raked over Amelia, full of disdain. "I told you she was nothing but pride and shame." A murmur rippled through the men, their voices like the growl of distant thunder. Amelia's throat tightened. For years, she had swallowed such words. Tonight, the weight of them pressed harder than ever, but also strangely less. She could feel Takota's steady presence at her shoulder, Chayton's quiet strength beside her. Their silence lent her courage. Her voice shook but carried. "I gave them bread. I gave them fire. If that condemns me, then so be it." Elias laughed harshly. Hear her? She'd rather stand with savages than with her own. Amelia's tears froze on her lashes, but her chin lifted. "Better men stand behind me than you ever were." The words fell like stones, shocking even her. Silence followed, heavy as snow. Elias's smirk faltered, his jaw tightening with anger. The other men shifted uneasily, their certainty cracked. Sheriff Amos stepped forward then, lantern light etching his lined face. His eyes swept over Amelia, then the men behind her. He sighed, long and weary. "This isn't the way," he muttered to the others. "Go home." Murmurs rose, protests sharp, but his hand rested on the butt of his pistol, and none pressed further. One by one, grumbling, the men turned, lanterns bobbing back into the storm. Elias lingered, fury simmering, but at last he spat into the snow and followed. The storm swallowed them, leaving silence behind. Amelia stood in the doorway, chest heaving, hands trembling. She had spoken, truly spoken, for the first time in years. She closed the door, the bar thudding back into place. Her knees buckled, and she nearly collapsed, clutching the carving still warm in her palm. Tears spilled freely now, not only of shame but of release. Behind her, Dakota placed a hand on her shoulder, steady, grounding. Chayton watched her, his gaze unreadable, yet carrying a depth that made her breath catch. The fire crackled, filling the silence they did not rush to break. Outside, the storm raged still, but within the cabin another storm had shifted. And in the hush that followed, Amelia understood. The worst had not yet come. Tonight had been only the first test. The storm raged on through the night, piling snow high against the cabin walls until the world outside seemed erased. Inside, the fire had burned low, but the silence carried a new weight. Not the hush of loneliness Amelia had always known, but the fragile quiet of lives tethered together by defiance. She sat close to the flames, clutching the carving still warm in her palm, her eyes swollen from tears. Chayton stood at the window, his profile carved against the faint glow of stormlight, while Dakota slept near the hearth, his breath steady, a rock in the restless night. Yet Amelia could not sleep. Every word hurled at her still echoed in her skull. Shameful, ruined, proud. The townsfolk had turned back, yes, but not defeated. She could feel it, like a shadow lingering outside the walls. Their judgment would return, sharpened by Elias's venom. And when it did, she would be forced to choose whether she lived bent beneath it or stood upright. Near dawn, the storm eased to a fragile lull. The wind sighed instead of howled, and light bled faintly through the frost-laced window. But before Amelia could breathe relief, a sound tore through the hush. Voices again, closer, harsher, not muffled this time but distinct. Boots crunching over hard snow. The sharp clink of metal. Dakota stirred at once, rising to his full, towering height. Chayton's gaze sharpened, and he turned from the window with a look that confirmed Amelia's fear. They had returned, not with whispers, not with lanterns, but with intent. Her chest tightened. "They mean to drive you out," she whispered. "And me with you." Chayton's expression did not waver. "Then we will not bend." The first blow against the door came hard, rattling the beam. Elias Boone's voice thundered above the storm's lull, dripping with scorn. "This ends now, Amelia. Choose your place, among your own, or among the dogs you've taken in." Amelia's body trembled. Fear coiled, but with it rose something fiercer. Anger, long buried, now breaking loose. She thought of every year she had walked with lowered eyes, every laugh at her back, every whispered judgment. And she realized Elias was wrong. She had no place among those who built their belonging on her exclusion. She turned, facing the two men who had become mirrors of her own exile. "I won't send you out," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "Not for them. Not ever." Dakota's scarred mouth curved into something almost like a smile, fleeting but fierce. Chayton inclined his head, solemn, as though sealing a pact. The blows against the door grew harder, voices shouting, demanding. Sheriff Amos's voice rose among them, but softer, uncertain, a man caught between law and mob. Amelia's hands shook as she lifted the bar, and flung the door wide once more. Snow poured in, light blinding against the white. The townsmen stood arrayed like an army, Elias at the front, his eyes alight with cruel triumph. Behind him, faces familiar yet strange in their hatred, their fear. "You shame yourself," Elias barked. "You shame us all." The words struck like stones, but this time they did not sink. Amelia stepped into the doorway, her shawl whipping in the wind, her dark hair wild against the snow. Behind her, the two giants stood tall, white-haired, silent, their dignity brighter than any weapon. She lifted her chin, voice ringing clear against the frozen air. "If kindness is shame, then I will wear it proudly. If sheltering men who have suffered makes me unfit, then I will never be fit for you." Her breath came hard, but she did not falter. "You cast me aside long ago, Elias. You do not get to name me now." The words stunned the air. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some uncertain, some disapproving, but none as loud as Elias's rage. His face reddened, his fists clenched. He stepped forward, ready to strike her with words or worse. And then Chayton moved. Not with violence, but with presence alone, stepping into the threshold, his tall frame eclipsing hers, his gaze burning into Elias's. He said nothing, yet the silence was thunder. Dakota stepped beside him, broad as a wall, his scarred hands resting calmly at his sides. Two exiles who had endured worse storms than this stood now as her shield. Elias faltered. His bluster cracked under the weight of their unspoken defiance. The sheriff finally raised a hand, his voice cutting through. Enough. His eyes swept the crowd, weary, stern. This is foolishness. Go home before blood stains the snow. Some grumbled, but the storm of will had broken. One by one, men turned away, their certainty crumbling. Lanterns bobbed back toward town, swallowed by the pale dawn. Elias lingered, his jaw tight, eyes burning with hatred, but even he could not stand alone. With a final sneer, he spat into the snow and followed. Silence returned, vast and trembling. Amelia's body sagged with relief, knees weak, breath ragged. She had not just endured their judgment, she had defied it. For the first time, she felt something bloom inside her not shaped by others' eyes. Dignity, fragile but alive. She turned back into the cabin, shutting the door against the cold. The fire welcomed her, crackling, alive. She leaned against the wall, tears spilling, but these were not tears of shame. Takota placed his hand once more on her shoulder, steady as earth. Chaitin's gaze met hers, deep and unyielding, carrying a silent recognition. They were no longer strangers. The storm outside eased into stillness, snow falling soft as feathers. Within the cabin, 3 exiles sat in the fragile circle of firelight, bound not by blood but by something stronger. The refusal to bend beneath scorn. Amelia looked at them, her voice raw but steady. Stay. Not just for one night. As long as you wish. The fire popped, sparks leaping like stars, and in their glow the white-haired men bowed their heads in silent acceptance. The snow pressed against the cabin, but inside, warmth held. For the first time in years, Amelia felt the ache of her solitude lift. She had stood, she had spoken, and she had not broken. And as dawn brightened the horizon, painting the snowfields in pale gold, she knew the town's whispers would not vanish. But she also knew they no longer had power to name her. The world outside was vast and cold, but here in this small cabin, dignity had been kindled into flame.